Here we go. All right. So we've been talking about the Wilderness Act and kind of the initial couple sentences that we've already been through, in kind of citing the justification for wilderness. It identifies a couple of pretty negative things: increasing population, accompanied by expanding settlement, growing mechanization, and these days we might say sort of a more general technological advancement, because Wilderness Act doesn't really think too much about advanced materials, microelectronics, portable computing, stuff like that. And kind of the unspoken association with those things of increasing population, expanding settlement, like development further out into wildlands and pressing up against it, and then sort of growing into it in some ways. And that growing mechanization, there's a value judgment on that those are bad things. So if we're going to be managing wilderness areas, we need to understand kind of our personal sense of what do we think about that value judgment. We don't necessarily have to agree with that, but if we're going to be working in land management, we at least have to enforce it. So we have increasing population. People making babies. And this was absolutely exploding in the 1960s, right? So with advancements in healthcare, economic growth following World War II and stuff like that, this is kind of that brief window of the stereotype of the American dream where wage erosion hasn't started. That'll happen in about 1970 onward. And pretty much everybody who wants a job has a job, and it's a pretty okay paying job, right? Each dollar buys a lot. So you might not get a huge paycheck, but you can still get a bunch with it. It's called purchasing power. And our purchasing power today is about half of what it was in 1970. So, with inflation and stuff like that, the number on the paycheck goes up, but the real cost of stuff relative to that has gone up about twice as much. So these days, it's a lot harder for us to have like the single income family in a house that they own with college degrees that they worked one summer to pay off completely and stuff like that, right? Like that doesn't even sound sane these days, right? It's just not within reach of most anybody except for like those 1%ers, whoever they are. So we want to understand, okay, there's not just a statement here, but there's like a value proposition or a value choice going on here. So use that word development again. And finally, mechanization, which now we would call technology and stuff like that. But, back in the 50s and 60s, it was like mechanical developments. Like this is a period of extremely fast development and growth for stuff like cars and stuff like that. We get from like everybody driving their Model A in the 1930s to this just explosion of all the Rust Belt car companies that are now increasingly overseas. Okay, so our question to kind of kick off our walk for today, starting in a couple minutes here if Ian shows up or not. What do we do, or what do we think about any of these things today? Like, do we agree with the negative evaluations of these things from that point? John?
Well, as far as settlement, I say like we're getting more greedy and misusage of the land. I speak for like suburbia, for example. There was a lot of places that were, what do you call those water runoffs?
Like Retention ponds?
Retention ponds, yeah. So there was a lot of retention ponds in the area because of all the floods that used to be farmland.
Mm-hmm.
So what did they do? They filled them up and then built a house right on top of it without letting it settle or any of that stuff. So I'm assuming that is not part of a wilderness act, but it's leading to like the thinking of, you know, the misusage of and not respecting of the land and how we should go about not conquering it, but depopulating it, for example. I mean, we had families in the 1900s, I mean, Irish families, Italian families, that had 12 flipping kids.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't do any of this stuff that we're doing now, so I feel like there needs to be adjustment, as we said in the one class. You know, there needs to be tweaks and adjustments, and decreasing population does tend to happen in decades, and decreased population happens in decades too. So therefore, like, that could lead to like an increase and a decrease in the booming of housing market and land ownership. Sorry for going on that little, but I feel like I covered most of what I feel like. Did I miss anything, guys? Anything to add?
Snowpiercer logic,
I mean, I know you're from Oklahoma. How does that, like, do they do the same shit over there too? Like,
yeah.
I mean, you have a different terrain obviously than we do here with the clay. You have sand.
Our urban areas are really small.
What do you mean by small? Like under 1 million, 2 million people?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Like Oklahoma City's population is not huge. What's really interesting though is that if you exclude Alaska's land, like cities, Oklahoma City is the largest city by territory.
Okay.
Square footage of land. However, the actual what people would consider like the city, the like deep like city area is really small.
So like downtown area?
It's just the boundaries of what is called Oklahoma City expands a lot.
Or like St. Louis, true actual city of St. Louis isn't that big of an area. It's just super locked in by everything else, right? So we have kind of, you know, jumping forward 60 years, we have kind of an elaboration of these themes. Like, the population of the United States is going up. The native population of the United States is actually declining, right? Most developed countries in Europe, the northern half of the Western Hemisphere, stuff like that. So collectively first world countries. Their populations are static or declining, and in some cases declining pretty fast. Some
Like Sweden is like paying people to move there.
paying people to have babies, paying people to move there. Yeah, there are some pretty famous national ad campaigns put on by national governments of like, there's one that's like "Do It for Denmark," and people are proposing like everything they can, like you know, super extended paternity and maternity leave with your guaranteed job back, like your employer cannot fire you afterwards, and stuff like that, because, you know, our Western economic system is based on infinite growth. You know, if we buy into that system, you know, it's whatever. That's a whole other discussion for your econ class. But we are still net increasing our population with immigration. And if you're watching the news lately, Fox News loves to make a huge deal out of Biden's border crisis. And even the more liberal-leaning channels, you know, CNN, MSNBC, and stuff like that, they're acknowledging that, yeah, this is tens of thousands of people a day at times, even in sort of the off-peak season. So, you know, we get people on both sides of, you know, build a wall, don't build a wall, whatever, treat people humanely, sanctuary cities, whatever. That's all sort of outside the scope of wilderness management, except for where immigrants or asylum seekers and stuff like that are rolling through a bunch of big southern wilderness areas to try to get somewhere. And in that case, it's a very direct issue. So we have a net increasing population, but the character of that population is changing rapidly, right? So I think it's fair to say the pretty overwhelmingly Caucasian culture of the 1950s and 60s that gave rise to the Wilderness Act and put a lot of emphasis and importance on that, pretty soon now, we're going to tip over into being the majority minority as Caucasians. That's not good or bad, it's just changing times. And some sort of various slices of the American population pie tend to think pretty differently about stuff like wilderness, like not really caring much about it one way or the other, and stuff like that. So increasing population isn't necessarily exactly the same thing as increasing wilderness use or demand for wilderness supply, so to speak. So the equation's kind of changed in that way. Kind of same thing with settlements. So the neighborhood that I live in right now, kind of behind the co-op and Murdale and all that stuff, and the pretty legit barber shop right there.
Speaks from experience, I take it.
Yeah, those houses were built in the 1940s and 50s, kind of out of the Sears catalog, and the horrible like aluminum wiring and stuff, whatever. But it's reasonably dense. It's a whole bunch of 1/8 and 1/4 acre plots, and yeah, it's not high density, urban apartment condos and stuff like that. But now, since that stuff has been done in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and pretty well sort of leveling off by the 90s, now the big action in terms of where people are moving to is either very high density urban redevelopment, like taking, sort of the burnt out husk of downtown Detroit or whatever and building a bunch of like nice loft apartments and all that stuff and selling them for crazy amounts of money. Or this low-density ex-urban, where you have somebody building so-called McMansion. You guys all know what that is? It's like it's a cookie cutter of a house that's just like, it's really big. It's got that 3-car garage. It's built outside of city limits, so there's not a lot of like taxes or zoning or regulation or codes that you gotta check the box on. So it's cheap to build. It's cheaper to build a bigger house on a much larger parcel of land. That's typically farmland. And so what that's doing is what you were talking about. It's locking up some of our most productive farmland near major cities and sort of cladding it under the armor, if you want to take a positive spin on it, of, the 3-car garage and the she shack in back and the little duck pond and, one house on 5 or 6 acres. You can get several of those houses across the space of an entire old neighborhood. And so where we do have an increasing population overall, it's net increasing, we have fewer people taking over, so to speak, more land and pushing up much harder against things like wilderness areas. So the low-density ex-urban stuff is kind of an exacerbation of the settlement trend that the Wilderness Act speaks to. We also, in the 2020s, now have not just advanced mechanization. We consider stuff like electric bikes or drones or any of the sort of the hybrid mode vehicles. Like you can get, and they're not that expensive anymore. One of those like jet ski ATVs, where you drive it at 40, 50 miles an hour over land, and then you hit the water and you just keep on going. That's not really slowed down or stopped. And so the hedge that the Wilderness Act puts around mechanization and says, you know what, mechanization is awesome. American tanks helped win World War II. American bombers really helped win World War II. But we need to keep all that stuff out of certain areas, these wilderness areas. Now, gear manufacturers, because they need to keep designing new stuff, selling new stuff, they're going extra hard on technology. And so we have tents with integrated flexible solar panels in them getting hiked into wilderness areas and really kind of changing the vision of how these places can be used, because now that opens up a whole bunch of possibilities when you got a big old battery bank and a couple of 100 watts of solar power to supply to stuff in a wilderness area.
What's the point?
That's a great question. What is the point?
Stay inside of your house at that point.
Yeah.
You're still just going to use all that stuff.
Why do people buy $80,000, $100,000 RVs with
Camping.
whirlpools and satellite TV and broadband? I mean,
That's the new way of the forestry people that people think now, and that's what we have to deal with, are those kind of idiots. We think they're idiots, but they don't know any better.
and it's valid if they want that. Like, you know, in America, we place a lot of stock in the idea of, you know, this is kind of how I want to do things, and I'm going to work hard and afford it, and or finance it, and just kind of, you know, live my life, live my dream. One way that we're seeing kind of heavily mechanized, heavily developed, kind of that glamping side of stuff is with the whole, I'm sorry I'm even using these words, the viral social media push around hashtag van life. Right? There's a lot of people making their living essentially convincing other people low-key on social media that it's cool to buy a beater van, you know, tear it down to the frame.
But some of these people are buying like $150,000 like Mercedes Sprinter.
And
Oh,
they're
yeah.
converting them.
Absolutely.
They're going broke as shit because they're expecting the YouTube viewers to help them fund it.
Yep,
But listen,
absolutely.
And that's the state of America we're in. That's what he's bringing us all to.
And there's
Sorry to
not
jump to the ground, but
there's not a few of them. There's like an army of them out there because
what is that doing to the terrain? What's that doing to the landscape? What's that? I mean, yes, that's bringing certain people to certain national parks that they won't go to. For example, like Shawnee, because it's a small park, or let's say some of those small parks out west, even Washington or even Alaska. But you know, they're small for a reason because they're preserved-ish in a way for a reason. Like I'm sure if you walk down those settlements still, like even Alaska, you can find remnants from those trappers back in the day still out there. You can probably find like old fishing nets. Like that's still a part of history, but you're gonna get people who want to get down there and take a fucking selfie with it to be like, oh, I was here, here's my proof. Instead of actually just being able to like just enjoy it. Sorry I didn't go on that little soapbox tangent.
No.
I feel like that's how most of us feel in this room. Like,
so this is what our conversation is about, right?
Yeah.
And coming to grips with this stuff. And again, it's not wrong, it's not evil to want to live in that way. I mean, I can see, I'm a long-distance backpacker. Like, I get the allure of being able to carry everything that you really kind of need and care about on your back or in the bed of your truck and just, you know, not have to listen to a boss. Like, that sounds like a pretty good gig. I am coming up on a sabbatical in the fall semester, and, you know, that's going to be... Yep.
Doing a sabbatical this fall?
you
Yeah.
get a paid vacation.
Yeah, so from... Oh, it's still work, but...
I just
but it's
make
totally
my deals.
self-structured. Like, I got an email from... There's apparently a company that's successful enough to offer this to professors where they'll kit you out with basically the Tesla SUV model, whatever it is.
Oh, the like Cybertruck thing?
Not the Cybertruck,
Oh, is
the
it the
SUV,
actual-
but
yeah, yeah.
you know, it's big enough to, you know, throw a sleeping pad in back and stuff like that, and you can live out of it no problem, just like, you know, van lifers or whatever. And the thing is a massive battery, so you can plug your Elon Musk Starlink internet connection to it, and you can spend 4, 5, 6 months of your sabbatical, like, van life and moving around different national parks and stuff like that. You pull over on the side of the road and you're writing research articles or having your Zoom meeting or whatever, and there's a bunch of bison sitting right there. And that sounds pretty good even to me, you know, and I'm professionally interested in answering these questions, or at least asking these uncomfortable questions of, what do we do with this stuff? Like, what do we do with Starlink and a battery pack for your cell phone that's the size of a Tesla SUV. You know, you can go for a long time, pretty far, on that kind of a rig.
Yeah, but the drawback is you have to be near a power station to power up.
Every once in a while. But you don't even have to pay for gas, you know? It's super cheap to operate an electric vehicle once you get past the sticker
You
price.
have to pay for the electricity though.
Do you know?
Depends on the
Depends on who you
setup. Yeah, a lot of campgrounds, you know, for
There's also gas stations.
10, 12 bucks a night, you
Like
get a
Tesla
110 volt socket, yeah?
Installments at
Yeah.
gas stations. I don't think you have.
You don't have to pay for those because as long as they're the Tesla one.
Yeah.
I don't like Teslas, but still.
Yeah. When we bought our battery electric car last August, part of the offer to sweeten the deal, because they are a little bit more expensive versus the equivalent gas engine, was we'll give you 3,000 miles worth, or 3,000 kilowatt hours of free charge on fast chargers. And it's going to take us a couple of years to use that up because, you know, we charge them normally at home and stuff like that. But for all of our road trips for 3 years, they're free? I mean, it sounds pretty good. And so a lot of people are kind of waking up to this like, now, wait a minute. Like, I can just make, you know, the same car payment I'm making otherwise and get free travel out of it? Okay. And I don't have to change the oil on that thing, ever. There's no oil to change. So it's possible now, and this changes the reality on the ground for wilderness management quite a bit versus what the Wilderness Act folks could ever plan or anticipate or, you know, write the original act around. So we have some tools, we got some mechanisms at the law and the policy levels to kind of grapple with that. Like, there's some director's notes posted on the Park Service website, for example, that are pretty recent. And they just kind of update some things. They clarify some definitions. They acknowledge, hey, the original Wilderness Act could never have thought about something like the satellite communication emergency relay in this cell phone. They never could have thought of that. So what are we going to do with stuff like that? We're going to be prepared for when Apple starts calling our dispatch centers constantly, because people go harder, they go farther, they do more risky things when they feel like they have a safety net, like satellite emergency communication.
Oh, that also pushes the people who want to not have a safety net to further reaches.
Even farther out beyond that? Yeah, maybe so. So, is the Wilderness Act robust against that stuff? Right?
I don't know. The terminology is vague enough where you can kind of like, you know, you kind of squeeze and lump some things in or adjust for that. Like, in terms of like the no mechanized thing, that includes bicycles.
That includes bicycles.
And if it includes a bicycle, then it pretty clearly cuts out all of any sort of vehicular travel or anything like that through the wilderness, through the area.
But if you want to break that down even further, no mechanized thing, that means no wheelchairs, no people with amputee legs coming through. I mean, if you really want to pull the nits and grits out of that.
That's true. But I mean, at that point, then that's like...
So the Americans with Disabilities Act post-dates. It came after the Wilderness Act, and there's a principle in law called superseding authority, where, you know, they're not going to be total jerks to folks confined to wheelchairs. Like, that's okay. That's okay. And in fact, at places like Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, or Warren Dunes, Sleeping Bear Dunes, typically the agency will provide specific wheelchairs with big fat balloon tires that can go out on sand, real low pressure tires, you know, 510 psi, something like that, and those go out into the wilderness, and everybody's kind of cool with that. So there's some sensible sort of sensible loopholes and stuff like that. But
I know what you mean.
Yeah. It's like that lawyer speak, is
Yeah,
that
no,
one class.
absolutely. And that's like, I don't know, like when you're sitting here considering specifically the wilderness aspect, that's great.
Not only that, I want to compare the wilderness act to the U.S. Like it's in Canada.
National parks are obviously managed different compared to national forests. Except
Obviously,
both
yeah.
have units of wilderness within them.
Mm-hmm.
And that unit of wilderness is kind of universally managed across the departments to a degree. There's obviously some difference in management. But because it's designated wilderness area, they all have to meet
Certain
the Wilderness Act's criteria. So, like, thinking about back to
Well, I'm just thinking of
van
forest
life
policy.
type things,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm thinking of forest policy of what we had to go through where certain policies trump other policies
Yeah.
because of when they're dated or when they were amended.
Yeah.
And it's got to be a pain in the ass as like a ranger or a forester.
to keep up.
To not only keep up with that, but stay on the bureaucracy red line tape.
Yeah.
Like, I can't cross this certain road because that's managed by this dude, but if there's a fire over there, I got to fucking go put it out. You see what I'm saying? And
So, when we went to Utah with Dr. Ruffner, not when we went to Utah, we stayed on the Fish Lake.
okay.
And then we also went to, is it the Coconino? No.
Coconina's right by the Grand Canyon?
Yeah, no, this is by Bryce Canyon.
Okay.
I
Fish
forget-
Lake is over there.
Yeah, Fish Lake, but it's not the Dixie.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Dixie National Forest, sorry, that one. Bryce Canyon, we went and spoke to, like, the burn bosses and the fire ecologists that work for Bryce Canyon, and what they ended up speaking to us about was that they do have a joint force effort on situations that you said, where there is a fire. Like, if the Dixie's burning and it's traveling towards Bryce Canyon, they call Bryce Canyon, and the Bryce Canyon people end up joining on the Dixie fire, even though they're crossing jurisdictions and departments.
Yeah,
it's the
interagency
same thing.
fire dispatch,
Well, it's
absolutely.
the same thing with poachers, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, if someone's crossing on different county lines, they're going to work together to get the bastard.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying directly is to not reflect what the Wilderness Act, to go after the verbiage.
Yeah.
If that's making more sense.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like the verbiage, yes, has been amended, but I feel like it's not written for, like, the common man to understand. I feel like it's written more or less as a legality in case, like, someone breaks their leg, or example, like, they're not responsible in a sense. That's how it feels like to me whenever I've read these policies.
Yeah.
It's like they're not caring about the forest per se, or the soils, or the agriculture of it. They're more caring about what we do to it.
Yeah,
which
like
is
legally
a
covering
good way
those
to
things.
have, but I feel like they need to put more effort into, like, what the Native Americans did with their forest. I mean, how they manage their forest.
There's a little bit of movement in that direction.
There is, but I feel
But in wilderness, it's double hamstrung. So the setup on wilderness management, all of the on-site management. We'll talk about on-site versus off-site stuff. The on-site management all has to be done according to the so-called minimum tool rule.
Yeah.
So you guys heard of that before?
yeah.
It's okay if not. Yeah. So this is a pretty big deal. So a chainsaw can get a lot of sawyering work done, a lot of bucking up done of wind-thrown trees across your wilderness trail.
Correct.
But if a hatchet is lower complexity, lower organization, less mechanized, then the minimum tool rule says
Use
you don't
the
just
hatchet.
go for the lower technology thing, you go for the lowest. It's the minimum tool rule, not the lower tool rule. So our users
I've got a
are not constrained by the minimum tool rule, right? Every incentive for the backpacker is to have a fancy phone that can talk to space and, store all your maps, and pull in weather conditions, bring in your NOAA radio if you want to, and stuff like that. Like, people can go as high or low technology as they want to. Maybe not high mechanization, but high technology for sure. And on the ground, if you're the trail crew or you're the burn boss or what have you, it's not that way. Like, your hands are the ones that are putting in the sweat equity to clear that trail every spring and every fall sometimes, depending on where you're at. So, what do we think about that? I mean, we've seen kind of the further development of the trends from the 50s and 60s of the 1900s to where we're at today with things. And from the start, from day one, we've had this idea of, we're going to do it the hard way. We're going to do it the old-fashioned way. And the minimum tool often comes down to, like, your spade shovel, a hand weed whacker, a Pulaski, maybe a couple of other tools, maybe, a bunch of feed, and your shelter and stuff like that strapped onto your pack mule or a mule train, and you're out for a couple of weeks clearing and maintaining trail, and mostly closing down campsites that people create. So is this just a harebrained idea in the first place? Like, is this a cool thought experiment that just kind of, like, okay, guys, we had our fun time, we should not do this?
Okay, so the way I see
What do you
wilderness
think?
areas is, like, the idea behind it really solid. I enjoy the idea behind it.
Yeah, agreed.
The definition of it in terms of, like, minimizing human interference, minimizing, like, letting it just be its thing, is kind of some weird, like, oxymoron, because I feel like wilderness areas require more constant, more intensive management than most other spots in places like that. And I think that's partly due to the allure of visitors wanting to go to those places, which immediately brings a whole different set of management to that area. You know what I'm saying?
Forgetting what kind of force we're dealing with too.
Yeah.
That's the first step, is what kind of force we're dealing with, an even age stand or an uneven age stand. Because uneven age stands are more in the national forest where more people go.
Yeah.
So you manage that differently than an even age stand.
Yeah.
Ooh yeah, silviculture, baby.
And but does that make sense? Like,
It does to me.
In terms of what you just said, you're going to do trail clearing. You load up a pack mule. You've got your Pulaski, and a 30-inch tree is falling over the trail.
Yeah, I'm using
And
a
you
chainsaw.
have to clear that with an axe.
Yep.
I'm using a chainsaw.
You can't.
So-
in a wilderness area.
So that changes
And so
how
then-
you do trail management, right?
So
So
then-
maybe you don't clear it. You build, it's easier and cheaper to build
Around it, yeah.
180
just
feet
drag
of
it off.
trail that goes around the wind throw.
You have
And
a
after a
donkey?
whole bunch of years of that, your trail doesn't go like this. It goes, it's a whole bunch of zigzagging around stuff. And they were totally okay with that, with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. 4 years later, 1968, created Ozark Scenic Riverways, right?
It's a cool spot.
It is a cool spot.
I think we should
One of the big things that they did was they strapped dynamite to a bunch of trees on the bank and felled them into the river. Yeah, to create
So is that
structure.
not a mechanized? Would that not be considered a mechanized?
What mechanical
What
element?
mechanical thing did you use though?
It's chemical.
It's chemical, yeah.
Yeah.
I know you.
That doesn't count.
So
it's
it's
I
a
can-
little bit
I can
different.
go through a- I can go through a
Ozarks
wilderness
is
area
a
and-
wild and scenic river. So for different
that's the
sections
gray
of it,
area.
you can do kind of different things. And when you're on the water, they just kind of flow, no pun intended, into each
River
other.
with the locks, with the ships
Yeah.
going through. Like those sections are cleared off just for the Army Corps or engineering. The other sections are for federal waterways. But Coast Guard runs the rest, and Army Corps runs engineering and runs the rest. The other spots, I know, because I was a tugboat guy.
Because if you have a pack mule and you're clearing trails,
Or you have a one mule,
and
or
you're out
two?
there for like 2 weeks, you're in that wilderness area for 2 weeks
They
straight.
have a
Obviously,
driver
like, you're
scope.
moving through it, But in terms of, like, if on a national forest, for example, if you're managing a non-wilderness area stand, you're probably going to be in there for, like, unless it's a timber harvest, that's totally different.
Sure.
But you're probably going to be in there for, like,
2 days, 3 days, maybe.
Yeah.
And you're just
It didn't get out. You got a
you know,
whole other big work list to get through that season, right?
And you're gonna crank it out with like your mechanized tools and everything, but in terms of prolonged human exposure to that one stand, it may be another year before you return.
or 10.
And that area is probably less likely to have visitors strictly in that spot.
That's why they break management down into sections. When you go into the planning stage, you'll see like on different maps. We did this all the time. Like, okay, this is the year we're focusing on this, and next year we're focusing on this, and
You
this
rotate
is what
around?
should have been done.
With the NEPA guy. Like,
Yeah, that's
NEPA
what
plans.
Right, yeah, but that's ideally. But does it ever get done fully?
No.
Because we don't have enough boots on the ground.
You don't have enough boots on the ground, and then like, again, most of my like understanding of this comes from experiences in the West. But not only do you not have a lot of boots on the ground to do what you need to do, then also in areas like Fish Lake and Dixie National Forest, you have wildfires that break out every year.
Which
And
clears out
that
some of the shit.
immediately takes precedence for like manpower, time allotment, and how much you're doing.
But also think about
Absolutely.
that, what that fire's doing, it's clearing out. What they
Yeah,
have
well,
to manage
actually,
it,
that is one thing they
Yeah.
said though, is like in areas, if a wildfire breaks out in an area that they have for that year,
They
like
let
a
it go.
prescribed burn plan for that year,
Mhm.
a lot of times they will immediately, instead of putting it out or like fighting that fire, if they know it's going to go to that area,
They
just
cork
gonna let it
it.
roll.
Yeah.
a lot of times they just cut a fire break and let it rip.
Why would you not do
Yeah,
that?
why would
Yeah,
you not?
absolutely.
It's doing your job for you.
Yeah, so where we're getting with this conversation is
You have
this.
to have-
When we have wind throws, when we have wildfires interfacing with prescribed burns, and those are kind of modifying sometimes pretty big chunks of the landscape for you, kind of in a wholesale way. The response that does, the management response that does sort of come in behind that to restore function of that space, to, recut or clear the trails and stuff like that, it's going to be, and with the minimum tool rule in place, it's gonna look kind of bass-ackwards and kind of piecemealed and kind of dumb and like sort of sweaty, try-hard, extra effort from a certain distance if you kind of squint at it, maybe looking at some of these trails on the maps. And the original designers of the wilderness preservation system, they absolutely knew that. The idea was, if we put some hard constraints on what we can do, it's going to end up looking a whole lot more creative, and it's going to look a whole lot more wild. When you're clearing fire lines, blading it out with a bulldozer, for example, that technology, that mechanized technology, is going to have a certain kind of shape or conformation of those fire lines. They're lines. They're not squiggles, typically, right? At least in short sections that you can see when you're standing on them. Reaches of that fire line, as they're called. So if we want wild areas to look wild, and we remove our ability to cut big straight lines through those spaces because we're letting the wildfires go through. We're letting them burn right into, 3 years from now, prescribed area burn compartment because, it'd be nice to just sort of get that done by default. So, all this to say, technology shapes the physical appearance and setup of stuff. When you take away your ability to do some of that stuff, it starts looking pretty janky, and that's absolutely the point in terms of the actual policy coming out of that sort of vague wording the National is keying in on, looking at those first couple paragraphs of the Wilderness Act. So look at this path that we're on right here in Thompson Woods. This path is surfaced, it's hardened against impacts, and when you are able to clad a trail surface in tar and chip and asphalt like this is, or even more so in concrete, which is super durable. You put in concrete and you expect it to last 40, 50, 60 years. And now with some recent historical chemistry discoveries about Roman concrete, We're about to have self-repairing concrete that can last for centuries.
Yeah, seriously.
With those bigger chips of lime in there. So, when you use a certain technology or approach to building a trail, or a campsite, or a trailhead, or like an icon site, what a destination area that the trails are bringing people to on purpose. Front country destination sites or icon sites might be things like Old Faithful, you know? Backcountry ones might be like some waterfall. We've got a bunch of those around Southern Illinois, right? When we have a certain technology, it's gonna kind of low-key force a certain shape. Like, I don't have to route this trail the same way that I would if it's a dirt surface trail.
No, because the dirt surface trail is going to change throughout the season.
And it's going to erode like crazy if I do this alignment without armoring it up with some tar and chip to hold that soil in place.
Yeah, because then you also have to worry about, like, the grade and the
Yeah.
slope of each one.
Absolutely, you
Not only
do.
That, you know what this is also? It's a fire buffer.
Yeah.
So that's why
For
also...
low intensity surface fires. Yeah.
Mhm.
But yeah, but think about that also too. Like that also aids in fires too, helps with the control and management. If we want to continue with that language of this to what we're talking about,
So when we've got our spade shovel and a Pulaski and a weed eater, a hand weed whacker, we've got a pretty different view and shape and application of that manual technology onto the trail. So we're going to kind of wrap up our little conversation about the recent history from 1960s to 2020, last 60 years, by couching it in this weird gap in history that the Wilderness Act just totally out of whole cloth was like, this is our totally arbitrary set of decisions on what's okay and what's not. So up to about the year 1600, all of that technology, cool, except for wheels, right?
Yeah.
We don't have chains, like drive chains in 1600s. We don't really have belt-driven stuff. We don't really have mechanized stuff beyond the wheel or like very simple pry bars and levers and stuff like that. So up to about 1600, we good.
Catapults, you know.
Oh yeah,
They did have
catapults for throwing midgets around.
or trebuchets, the superior
or
siege.
ballistas.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, hey, you know they had blender boosters too.
True. By 1600.
So
I said blender boosters for a reason.
everything after 1600, not okay.
Well, we need to change it to the 1800s.
But all the technology after about 1980, okay. Mobile phones, radios, solar panels, advanced space composite fabrics, and
Don't forget your
resins and carbon fiber stays in your stuff.
And
Right? So from 1600 to 1980, evil
Your bags too.
Yeah.
for wilderness management. Pre-1600, post-1980,
We cool, baby. We cool.
yeah.
We cool, baby.
So we get this weird split between the folks who are legit getting after, I want to go out in the woods and I just want to go primitive for a little while. Like, I'm just going to walk it out there and kind of find some rocks to stack and sit on. Maybe build me a little redneck TV, a little fire.
I love that.
And that's a good day. Maybe that's a good week, you know? And other folks who are like, no, Mother Nature is a real motherfucker. We gotta tame this. We gotta file off these edges with our fancy phones. And I'm gonna get a new pair of Gore-Tex polytetrafluoroethylene lined boots.
Hell yeah.
And my feet are gonna be warm and dry as I walk through the wild hinterlands. And so we're managing for both of those.
I really do it, Mom.
And it's kind of a weird thing. All right, so sermon over for today. Let's head
Thanks,
on
preacher.
back. I'm around for questions as we walk back.
Let's get coming in here.
So, it hit me.